111, looking at Ruth chapter 2, the beginning, the first 7 verses. And we've entitled it, A New Beginning. By the way, you might have a pencil handy. There'll be tons of scripture references, and I'm going to have to move rather quickly because I've got so much jammed in here. Anyhow, where are we? Well, so far we've been introduced to Naomi's predicament, which included grief, suffering, as well as privation. She now had no means of support, as far as we know. What we begin to see, though, is God's ruling over her situation with abundant mercies and grace, something that we like to see in our own lives, without question. Well, Ruth and Naomi have just made the 50 to 70 mile trip from the high country in Moab down to the Jordan Valley and then rising back into the hill country around Bethlehem. Quite a walk they had. Now they are in Bethlehem where they intended to be. So in chapter 2, the new life begins. But the first verse gives us a foretelling of some things that are to come. I should say maybe a foreshadowing rather than a foretelling. And it goes something like this. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, that was her husband, of course, whose name was Boaz. Remember that Naomi and Ruth are itinerant widows. They've been traveling with no visible means of support so far as we know. Moreover, Ruth was in Israel by the grace of God. The law, remember, wasn't in her favor. She couldn't go into the tent of gathering and so forth. Well, a couple further details before we really get started. The term a man of great wealth in the Hebrew really means man mighty in valor. So Boaz was no ordinary old man. We don't even know how old he was, but the assumption is he was a bit older. The term is used of Gideon, by the way, and Jephthah, 2 of the judges. You can find Gideon in Judges 6, and Jephthah in Judges 11. There were 2 of Israel's judges, and they were warriors. Boaz, by the way, means in him is strength. Everything points to Boaz being one of the good guys, and a man. Family is better translated clan, I think. Clan is a cluster of families from the same tribe having a common ancestor other than the tribal originator. So we don't know who that would be in Elimelech's case. We're not talking about Judah, since he probably was from the tribe of Judah. We're relatively certain of that, I believe. You'll see that later. Well, if you want to look at the short version, it's this. Israel is a nation consisted of tribes that are subdivided into clans, which are further subdivided into families. Now, Boaz was related to Naomi's Elimelech, it said, but it didn't say how he was related. Not eliminated. Did I say eliminated? No, Elimelech. There you go. I'll get it straight in a minute. Hopefully I don't run out of time stumbling around like this. Well, the relationship between Boaz and Elimelech will play a major part in our story a bit later. In the Old Testament, for example, I'm going to talk about some of these relationships. A brother of a deceased husband of another woman, who would be, the brother-in-law of the deceased, was designated for several different roles. The first is the levirate marriage, Levirate. if the widow were without a son. Lever, Levir, incidentally, is from, I believe, the Latin, which means brother-in-law. So this was like brother-in-law marriage, not that the brother-in-law married, but the brother-in-law was to replace the brother if he died, leaving no male heir. Then there is the Kinsmen Redeemer, who's designated to purchase the brother out of slavery, if that happened to be the case. And he also has a responsibility to buy back the property of a brother where the brother may have had to sell the land. And that's an important issue in Israel, was the land. Then finally, there is what's called the blood avenger, who was to avenge crimes committed against any member of the family. And a blood avenger comes because typically that would mean some kind of vengeance against the murderer of a brother. Let's look at Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. And it describes some of this. When brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother, that's the brother-in-law, shall go into her, take her to himself as a wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out from Israel. In other words, the purpose is to continue the family line. But if the man does not desire to take his brother's wife, and this was a legal obligation, and it says if he doesn't really choose to do that, then the brother's wife, the one who is supposed to become the wife of the brother-in-law, the brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to establish a name for his brother, an heir, in Israel. He is not willing to perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city shall summon the man, him, and speak to him. And if he persists and says, I do not desire to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the sight of the elders. This is all a public event. Pull off his sandal, that's the sandal of the brother-in-law, off his foot, and spit in his face, and she shall declare, thus it is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And in Israel his name shall be called the house of him whose sandal is removed. So it was a public shaming of the man who would not perform the brother-in-law's duty under the law. If you wish to see where this Levirate provision ran amok, then read Genesis 38. It's a story of Judah and Tamar. Some of you will remember that particular story. Well, let's talk about the Kinsman Redeemer for a moment. If a relative sells himself into slavery, the Kinsman Redeemer is to provide for his release if the brother can't do it himself. Kinsman Redeemer doesn't necessarily have to be the brother. It can be any close relative that's selected. Let's look at Leviticus 25, verses 47 through 49. Now, if the means of a stranger or of a sojourner with you becomes sufficient, a guy does well, and the countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to him as to sell himself to a stranger who is sojourning with you, or to the descendants of a stranger's family, then he shall have redemption right after he has been sold. In other words, he can say, I will become indebted to you, I'll become a bondservant, do what you want, and it's for money. He's doing it for money. But one of his brothers may redeem him. This is finishing out 48, moving into 49. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle's son, a cousin, may redeem him, or one of his blood relatives from his family may redeem him, or if he prospers, he may redeem himself. So the kinsman redeemer has the responsibility for buying a brother or a relative out of slavery, if that's doable. But there's another case too, and this is the case of property. Property, remember, is to remain in a family forever, according to the law of Moses. Leviticus 25, verses 23 through 27. The land, moreover, shall not be sold permanently. If you get in debt and you need to sell the land for money to live on, then that shall not be sold on a permanent basis. For the land is mine, that's God speaking. For you are but aliens and sojourners with me. He's telling his people, the Israelites, you're only here as aliens and sojourners with me, just as everybody else is. It's my place. Thus, for every piece of your property, and this is what was assigned to the family at the conquest. Joshua was in charge of that. You are to provide for the redemption of the land. And I'll read that again. Thus, for every piece of your property, because you can't sell it permanently, you are to provide for the redemption of the land. If a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor he has to sell part of his property, then his nearest kinsman is to come and buy back what his relative has sold. Keep it in the family. Excuse me. But there's a special case also. Continuing in chapter 25 of Leviticus with verses 26, 7, and 8. Or in the case a man has no kinsman, but so recovers his means as to find sufficient for its redemption, then he shall calculate the year since its sale and refund the balance to the man to whom he sold it, and to return to his property. So if he got some money somewhere along the line, he could redeem his own property by paying back part of the property price. We'll get a minute as to how you determine that percentage that you need to pay back. Verse 28, but if he has not found sufficient means to get it back for himself, this is the key now that we've just mentioned, then what he has sold shall remain in the hands of its purchaser until the year of Jubilee. But at the Jubilee, it shall revert, that he may return to his property. So in the year of Jubilee, property returned to the original family owners. It can be sold, and then it can be returned at the year of Jubilee. And again, in Leviticus 25, we go back to verse 10, it says this, you shall thus consecrate the 50th, 50th year, and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. There was more than property involved, by the way. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. So, when you went to sell something, you had to figure out what the value of the property was. Well, the question is, how many years is it to Jubilee? that determines what the property will be, because they figure out a per year value and then multiply by the number of years to the Jubilee. And consequently, if you bought it back after selling it, the portion that you still owed the man was the percentage of the Jubilee time remaining, the number of years back to the Jubilee in consideration of how many years it was when you sold it. So there's a little calculation. Now, our episode in the second chapter of Ruth, if we can move back to Ruth, begins as Ruth asks Naomi for permission. What to do what? To take responsibility for the well-being of the two of them. Verse 2 of Ruth 2. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field, there's evidently a large field in the area, and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, as Naomi said to Ruth, go, my daughter. Notice that the author has repeatedly reminded us that Ruth is a foreigner, a Moabitess. We'll be reminded that Ruth fills in an information gap concerning David's background, something we'll see near the end of the book of Ruth. So Ruth is there for a reason. The author also reminds us that God loves Gentiles as well as Israelites, because Ruth does find favor with God. And this is going to be used to broaden the religious outlook of the Israelites, who would have seen the Moabites as dogs or pigs, Gentiles, unclean, all of that. But here comes Ruth. We'll get into that as time goes by. It's quite clear, contrary to the Middle Eastern cultures of the day, that Yahweh is not a tribal God. I'm bringing that up because of God's involvement in all of this. Yahweh's not bound by national boundaries. As a matter of fact, in Athens, Paul made an interesting statement. I'm looking at Acts 17, where he was at the Areopagus preaching, verses 24, 5, and 6. And Paul says this, the God who made the world and all the things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. He's talking to Gnostics and Greeks who think they're pretty sharp people. Neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything. You think God needs you? No, he doesn't. He chooses to use you. Since he himself gives to all life and breath and all things. And he made from one every nation, that would be Adam and Eve, every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. Now catch this, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. He's not bound by any boundaries. As a matter of fact, he's the one that set all of the boundaries for the nations. Now, what about the word gleaning? I know most of you are going to understand it, but it is a legal requirement, it was a legal requirement on the farmers to permit outsiders to pick grain as a form of welfare. So farmers, when they were harvesting, were told to leave, it's called the corners of the fields, unharvested. In other words, you sort of take out the middle of the field, but you leave some around the edge that you do not gather and harvest. So the people in need could come and get permission to harvest what remained in the field after the harvest was completed. So the poor were also allowed to pick up any grain left lying on the ground. In one place they're told, if you drop something on the ground, don't go back and get it, just leave it there. Somebody will pick it up and live and survive because of it. Looking at Leviticus 19, verses 9 and 10, that describes this. Now when you, the farmer, reap the harvest of your land. You shall not reap to the very corners of your field, neither shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, nor shall you glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen fruit from your vineyard. Fruit falls off the tree, let it stay. You shall leave them for the needy and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God. This was a form of welfare. When you reap your harvest in your field and have forgotten a sheaf in the field, sheaf would be a collection of stalks of grain that are tied together into a bundle to be moved to the threshing floor. You shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the alien, for the orphan, and for the widow. There's the three categories of people that this is designed for: the sojourner or alien, the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. So Ruth heads out. Verse 3. Chapter 2, of course. So she departed and went and gleaned in the field. So there's evidently one field under consideration here. After the reapers are those who are doing the harvesting for the owner. And she happened to come to the portion of the field. Evidently, this was a large field that was subdivided, maybe a community field. We don't really know. But part of it was belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech, reminding us again the connection with Naomi. The portion of the field seems to imply that this was, again, a very large field, perhaps a community field of some sort, and Boaz owned evidently a sizable plot within that field. Ruth, just notice, happened to end up at Boaz's field. It seems to imply she had no idea who Boaz was, nor had she been sent there by Naomi. There are some who believe that Naomi knew about this and sent Ruth there as part of a sneaky plot of some sort. But the narrative gives no hint that Naomi planned this. However, there is someone who did plan it. That would be Yahweh, God. God's providence brought the two to Bethlehem at harvest time when gleaning could support them. If he'd have brought them there when there was no harvest, they wouldn't have any way to support themselves. And it also seemed reasonable to believe that God's providential care guided Ruth to Boaz's plot. Well, next, Boaz arrives at the field. He wasn't there when they were harvesting, evidently. So it must have been outside the town because he comes from town. Ruth, verse 4, chapter 2. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "May the Lord be with you." And they said to him, "May the Lord bless you." So very nice give and take of blessings between Boaz and his workers. But then he evidently sees Ruth, and he asks the foreman a question in verse 5. Then Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, that is a foreman, as we would call him, "Whose young woman is this?" That's a strange thing for us to ask, but whose is this? Whose young woman is this? Seems to ask about her ancestry. What country, what tribe, what clan, what family? Where is she? Or he may have been asking really whether Ruth belonged to another man or not. The foreman evidently knew something of Ruth and probably gained by asking her some questions because she first approached him for permission, apparently. Verses 6 and 7. And the servant in charge of the reapers answered and said, "She's the young Moabite woman," there we're reminded again, "who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. And she said," in other words, here's what Ruth said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." And then he goes back and talking again. Then, thus, she came and has remained from the morning until now. She's been here all day. And she's been sitting in the house for a little while. In other words, there was a place where evidently she could rest for a bit. Sheaves, again, were the individual bundles that were made, tied up stalks, and then they were put into clumps and then picked up later, taken to the threshing floor. The house, by the way, is probably just a temporary shelter with some kind of framework and then some branches covering it. It was placed alongside the road that would have been on the outside of the field, perhaps. So Ruth didn't simply go out and glean. She first asked permission to. Remember, she said to Naomi she wanted to find favor with someone. Well, she evidently has. Ruth was industrious, it seems. She worked all day with just a few little rest breaks. Here's a question for you. Anybody who wants to think about it. Jim, let me ask you, why do you think Naomi didn't go out to glean also? Why did she allow Ruth to be the sole person gleaning? Remember this, there would not have been a ton of grain left in the field, so pickings are slim if we're going to use that term. So Ruth probably could have used some help. Now, Naomi was older than Ruth, obviously, a generation older, but why might she not have gone out? Well, we're not told, of course. Let me give you a couple takeaways. God is sovereign, and he exercises providential care over his own. You're one of God's own. He's looking out for you. He is sovereign. He is capable, and he will care for you in his way for his purpose. The second, Ruth shows us that God is able to use our first efforts toward our good and his goals. What am I meaning? Well, Ruth had to go out, decide to go out, actually go out, seek permission, and then begin to do the work. Things are going to multiply for her after these first steps that she has taken. But it's like the priest. When Israel was to cross the Jordan, the water was at flood stage, but the priests had to put their feet into the water first. Then God pushed back the waters of the Jordan and they could cross. Thirdly, God will often put people in our path who will contribute to the success of our work for the kingdom. Ruth is on track for something God has in mind for her, and he has put Boaz in her path for a reason. Our God has no boundaries or no limitations other than his own attributes. Excuse me, he can't do anything that violates his own nature. Other than that, and anything that's logically possible, he is capable of. In our next session, we're going to see how this initial contact between Ruth and Boaz plays out, and that will get us to moving on into the heart of the story in the rest of Ruth. I'll look for you next.